I'm Samantha Overton, 34 years old, and I stopped by my grandfather's house on a gray Tuesday in October without calling first. Walter opened the door before I finished knocking. His face was the color of paper. He grabbed my sleeve, pulled me across the threshold, and whispered the words I still hear at night. "Get inside, quickly, hide right now." I opened my mouth to ask why. Then I heard tires crunch the gravel behind me, and my mother's car rolled into the driveway. He pushed me toward the kitchen, toward the narrow gap behind the pantry cabinet. My grandfather didn't look confused. He looked like a man who had been waiting for me. In the next 40 minutes, I heard things that changed how I saw my mother forever, and what I did after that broke my family apart. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people find their voice, and the truth always finds its way to the table. If stories about family, courage, and standing your ground move you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. The gap behind the pantry smelled like cold coffee and old wood. I pressed my back to the wall and made myself small. My heart hit my ribs so hard I was sure they could hear it. The front door opened without a knock. My mother's voice came first, bright and warm in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Dad, it's just us. Don't get up." Footsteps crossed the living room. 2 more people followed her. I recognized Gerald's slow, heavy walk, the man she'd married a little over a year ago. The third set of steps was quick and light. A woman I didn't know, heels clicking on the hardwood my grandfather had laid himself. I heard the couch cushions sigh as someone sat. I heard my grandfather ask, in a thin, wandering voice, whether anyone wanted tea. Nobody answered him. Instead, the strange woman spoke, all business, and set something heavy on the coffee table. Papers. A thick stack of them, the kind that make a soft, expensive slap when they land. "We'll keep this simple, Walter," she said. "Just a few signatures today." My mother made a soothing sound, the one she used to make when I was small and scared, the one that used to mean safety. Now it made my skin crawl. I stayed frozen behind the cabinet, staring at a slice of the kitchen through the crack, and I understood that whatever was about to happen in that living room was not a visit. It was an operation, and my grandfather had known it was coming. That was why he'd hidden me. I just didn't know yet how deep it went. Let me back up, because you need to know who was standing in that room. My mother, Paula, is 57, and my whole life she ran our family like a thermostat. When she was warm, everyone relaxed. When she went cold, we all rearranged ourselves to warm her back up. I learned early that peace cost something, and the price was usually me giving in. I'm a geriatric nurse. I spend my days with people my grandfather's age, reading their charts, catching the small changes families miss. I know what it looks like when someone healthy is treated as if they're already gone. Gerald, her new husband, was 60, a man who wore good shoes and talked about deals that never quite closed. I'd met him maybe 6 times. The woman with the heels I had never seen before. What made my stomach turn wasn't just the papers. It was that 3 weeks earlier my grandfather had stopped calling me on Sundays, the way he had for years, and a bank letter meant for him had shown up forwarded to my mother's address. I'd noticed. I'd actually called the bank to ask why, because that's what you do. They told me they couldn't discuss another person's account with me. I wasn't on it. I had no standing. I remember hanging up and telling myself I was being paranoid, that families forward mail all the time. I wanted to be wrong so badly. Crouched behind that pantry, listening to a stranger tell my grandfather to sign, I finally understood I hadn't been paranoid at all. I'd been early, and I'd let myself be talked out of it. That's the part I still can't forgive. The stranger walked him through it in a flat, practiced voice. She said the papers would let my mother handle things, so Walter wouldn't have to worry. Financial power of attorney, she called it. Once he signed, my mother could manage his accounts, his bills, everything. Then Gerald spoke, and his voice was softer, which somehow made it worse. He said the house was really too much for a man alone. He said there was a lovely place across the county, assisted living, and once the house sold it would pay for the best care. My grandfather made a small, lost sound and asked what would happen to his garden. Nobody answered that either. My mother leaned in, and her voice dropped to the register she uses for hard truths. "Dad, we've been over this. You forget things now. This is for your own good." Then she said the thing I will hear until the day I die. "He won't remember by Christmas anyway." She said it the way you'd mention rain. Not cruel exactly. Worse than cruel. Certain. I bit down on my own knuckle to keep quiet. My eyes burned. Through the crack I could see the edge of my grandfather's chair, his hand resting on the armrest. And I watched that hand move. Not shaking the way a frightened old man shakes. Steady. He had a pencil stub, and against the side of the chair where they couldn't see, he was writing something small and careful on a scrap of paper. My grandfather, the man they'd just declared too far gone to run his own life, was quietly taking notes. My heart was breaking, and something else was waking up at the same time. I didn't know yet that he wasn't the one who needed saving. He was the one running the trap. For the next few minutes, my grandfather put on the best performance I have ever seen. He forgot Gerald's name twice, calling him the fellow from the bank. He asked the same question about the garden 3 times in a row, until my mother's patience frayed to a thread. "Dad, please," she snapped, and I heard the real Paula slip through the warm mask, tight and impatient. The stranger tried to guide the pen into his hand. He fumbled it and knocked it to the floor and apologized in a small, confused voice, and I heard Gerald sigh the sigh of a man watching money take too long to arrive. They decided he was too tired to sign today. My mother said they'd come back at the weekend when he was having a better day. I could hear the disappointment in the room, thick as smoke. And then, while they gathered their coats and the stranger tucked the papers back into her bag, my grandfather did the thing that told me everything. He turned his head, slowly, toward the kitchen, toward the exact spot where I was hidden. And for 1 second his eyes were not cloudy at all. They were sharp and clear and completely present. And they found me in the dark behind that cabinet like he'd known where I was the whole time. He gave the smallest shake of his head. "Stay quiet. Wait." Then the fog rolled back over his face and he asked, to no one, whether it was time for supper. My hands were shaking. My grandfather was not confused. My grandfather was pretending to be, and he was doing it so well that his own daughter believed it. The question that filled my whole chest was simple and terrible. How long has he been acting? They left the papers on the coffee table for him to look over. My mother kissed the top of his head and told him to rest. The front door clicked shut, the car started, and the gravel crunched again as they backed out. I counted to 60 in the dark the way you count during a storm, waiting to be sure. Then my grandfather said, in his own real voice, low and steady, "You can come out now, Sam." I came out on legs that didn't want to hold me. He was standing by the window watching the empty driveway, and when he turned to me he looked 10 years younger and unspeakably tired at the same time. I asked him what was happening. He pulled me into a hug that smelled like cedar and pencil shavings, and he explained it in the plain way he explained everything. Once a small-town accountant, always one. He'd suspected for months that Paula and Gerald were after the house. He'd started playing forgetful so they'd lower their guard and show him the whole plan instead of taking it piece by piece. "If I'd told you your mother was doing this," he said, "you'd have found a reason to doubt me. You needed to hear it yourself." That was why he'd made me hide. Not panic. Strategy. Get inside, quickly. Hide right now, so that his granddaughter, the nurse, the one person who might actually stop this, would be an ear in the wall. Then he reached into his cardigan pocket and pressed the scrap of paper into my hand, the one he'd been writing during the whole terrible meeting. On it, in his neat accountant's hand, was a name and a number. "Start here," he said. "And Sam, your mother has a key to this house. She can come back any time." I sat down at his kitchen table and made him explain the paper. The name was Ruth Delgado, an elder law attorney who'd handled his affairs decades ago, back when my grandmother was alive. The number underneath wasn't a phone number. It was a dollar amount. 18,000. "That's what's gone," he said, "in 3 months." He'd noticed the account balance dropping. Small withdrawals he never made. A few hundred here, 1,000 there, spaced out so they wouldn't trip an alarm. When he'd called the bank, a new authorized contact had been added to help him, and the help was bleeding him dry. He'd stopped calling me on Sundays because Paula had started dropping by on Sundays, and he didn't want her to know how close he and I still were. Everything I'd half noticed and talked myself out of clicked into a single clear picture. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan with a timeline. The house he'd built, the retirement he'd saved for 4 decades, the little memorial fund he kept in my grandmother's name, all of it was on the table, and so was his dignity, which to him mattered most of all. He told me he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being erased while he was still alive, packed off to a facility and voted out of his own life by the people who were supposed to love him. I looked at the papers still sitting on the coffee table, the pen the stranger had left beside them like a dare. I thought about my mother's voice. He won't remember by Christmas anyway. And I made a decision I couldn't take back. "They're not getting this house," I said. He almost smiled. "Then we'd better hurry. She has a key." I drove the 15 minutes back to my own house with my hands tight on the wheel and my mind going in circles. My whole life I had managed my mother by folding. Not because I was weak, but because folding was cheaper than the war. Now the war was here whether I wanted it or not, and the old reflex kept whispering that if I just stayed quiet, kept the peace, none of this would get worse. I knew better. I'd seen this exact story from the other side, at work, in charts and family meetings. I knew that the reflex to keep the peace is exactly what these situations feed on. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what nurses do. I researched. What I found made my stomach drop. Adult children are the most common perpetrators of elder financial abuse, not strangers on the phone, not scammers overseas, their own kids. Nearly 40% of the cases reported to federal regulators are adult children draining a parent. And a power of attorney, once signed, is brutally hard to undo. If my mother got that signature, she wouldn't be breaking the law anymore. She'd be operating inside it, legally, with my grandfather's own name giving her permission. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m. with a legal pad and started writing down everything I knew: dates, amounts, the forwarded letter, the stranger with the papers. Over-responsibility has always been my flaw, my need to carry what isn't mine. For once, it was pointed at the right target. By the time the sky went gray, I had a plan that started with one phone call. I sat in my car outside his house long after they left, part of me still wanting to believe I'd misheard. If you've ever caught someone you love in a lie you can't unhear, you know that silence. Stay with me, because what my grandfather did next changed everything. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe. Ruth Delgado remembered my grandfather the second I said his name. "Walter Rayburn," she said, warm and quick. "Sharpest man in Belhaven, how is he?" I told her the truth, and the warmth in her voice turned into something harder and more useful. She'd spent 30 years on elder law, and she'd seen this exact machine at work more times than she could count. She laid out the situation for me in plain terms, no comfort padding, which I appreciated. As long as he hadn't signed the power of attorney, we still had a door open, but it was closing. To hold it open, we needed 3 things. First, proof that my grandfather was mentally competent, a real capacity evaluation from a doctor, so no one could claim he didn't know what he was doing. Second, documentation of the money that had already moved, the withdrawals, the added contact, all of it. Third, we could report the whole thing to Adult Protective Services and let the state investigate. "But Samantha," she said, and her voice dropped, "if they've scheduled a signing this weekend, we're talking days, not weeks. Once he signs, everything gets 10 times harder. We'd be fighting to unwind a legal document instead of stopping one." I asked what I could do that would matter most right now. She thought for a second. "You're a nurse," she said. "You know how a capacity evaluation works. Get him one, from someone credible, on the record. That's the wall they can't climb." because their entire plan rests on one lie, that he's not competent. Prove he is, and the plan collapses. I hung up with a to-do list and a countdown. Days, not weeks. And my mother had a key to his front door. Here is where my job stopped being a job and started being a weapon. Not the kind my mother used. She dealt in warmth turned on and off, in guilt, in papers slid across a table to a man she'd told everyone was too foggy to read them. My weapons were different, and that difference is the whole point. She worked in manipulation. I worked in documentation. She wanted my grandfather declared incompetent behind closed doors. I would get him examined in the open, by a doctor whose signature meant something. I called Dr. Hale, a geriatrician I'd worked beside for 6 years, a man so careful he double-checked his own double-checks. I told him what I was seeing. He didn't hesitate. He booked Walter for a full cognitive evaluation that Thursday, 2 days out. Not a favor, not a shortcut, a real exam with real scoring that would stand up anywhere. I explained it to my grandfather over the phone that night, and he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Let them say I'm gone. I'll take the test and prove I'm here." That was the shape of it now. My mother's whole scheme leaned on a single claim, that he couldn't understand what he was signing. If a credible doctor put it in writing that he understood everything perfectly, her lie had nowhere to stand. I wasn't going to scream at her. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to build a wall of facts so plain that no amount of warm voice could talk anyone past it. I slept a little better that night. Not much, because I kept thinking about that key, and about how a signing scheduled for the weekend gave us almost no room, and about how people like my mother move faster the moment they sense they're being watched. My mother called me the next morning, and her voice was the warm one. That was the first warning. She only ever got that sweet when she wanted something. "Sweetheart," she said, "I've been meaning to talk to you about your grandfather." She told me he was slipping, that it broke her heart, that she and Gerald were just trying to protect him from himself. She said she'd hate for him to sign a bad contract or get scammed. The irony nearly made me laugh, and underneath the honey I could hear the real question she was fishing for. She wanted to know what I knew. The old me would have rushed to reassure her, to smooth the moment, to make her feel that I was on her side so the call would end without conflict. I felt the reflex rise up in my throat like it always did. I swallowed it. "That's really sad, Mom," I said. "And nothing else?" Flat. Safe. I gave her no thread to pull. There was a small silence on her end, the sound of someone recalculating. Then, casual as anything, she mentioned Grandpa's 80th birthday at the end of the month. "The whole family's coming," she said. "Neighbors, the pastor, everyone. It'll be lovely." She said it lightly, but I heard the weight under it. She was building an audience. Whatever she planned to do, she wanted it done in front of people, so it would look like consensus instead of a robbery. I said the party sounded nice and got off the phone before my voice could give me away. Then I sat very still. She was moving the date, not the weekend anymore, the birthday. She wanted witnesses, and that told me she was more dangerous than I'd feared, because she was thinking about how this would look. Wednesday, I took my grandfather to the bank. He wanted to change his mailing address back to his own house and get a printout of every transaction from the last 6 months. Simple, reasonable things a man is allowed to do with his own money. We sat across from a young banker named Trevor who kept glancing at his screen with a face that got more uncomfortable by the minute. My grandfather asked, politely, why his statements were going to his daughter's address. Trevor said a change had been requested on his behalf. My grandfather asked who authorized adding Gerald as a signer on one of his accounts. Trevor's ears went red. The change had ridden in on a limited authorization Renata had coaxed out of him weeks earlier, under the guise of help with the bills. Submitted in person with a notarized signature card that had cleared the bank's process. All technically in order. There it was, the thing I keep trying to make people understand. We did everything right and still hit a wall. My grandfather had caught it, questioned it, come in person to fix it, and it still wasn't a simple undo. removing an authorized user, disputing the withdrawals. All of it took time and process and, in some cases, both account holders' cooperation, which was exactly the point. The money was still moving through a door someone had propped open with a stamp. Then Trevor said the thing that turned my blood cold. Someone had already called ahead to tell the bank a financial power of attorney naming my mother was coming, any day now, so they'd be ready to honor it the moment it landed. The document itself wasn't signed yet. But the ground had been prepared, every rail laid in advance, so that his signature would be the only thing left to add. I asked Walter quietly if he'd signed anything. He hadn't. They weren't waiting on the bank. They were waiting on him, at the party, surrounded by people. We got the printout. We changed the address back. But I walked out of that bank understanding that the trap wasn't a plan anymore. It was already half built. That night, I went looking for the stranger with the heels. It didn't take long. Her name was Renata Poole, and she called herself an elder care consultant, which turned out to mean whatever she needed it to mean. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a licensed social worker. She was a notary who ran a side business, helping families with transitions, and the reviews I found painted a clear picture. She specialized in getting elderly people to sign things fast, before anyone in the family who might object could get in the room. One family wrote that she'd shown up while their father was on pain medication and walked out with a signature an hour later. She worked on commission, a cut of every transition she closed. To Renata, my grandfather wasn't a person. He was a deal. And the more I read, the more I understood what my mother and Gerald had actually assembled. Paula brought the trust, the warm daughter who'd say it was all for Dad's good. Gerald brought the motive and the paperwork. Renata brought the machine that turned an old man's confusion, real or faked, into legally binding ink. 3 people, 3 jobs, 1 target. Then I found the detail that made me put my laptop down and stare at the wall. Renata's online booking page showed a long block held open for the afternoon of my grandfather's birthday. No client name attached, just a signing session on a Saturday she'd otherwise marked as off. Lined up against the party my mother had just happened to mention, it didn't take much to see what it was. They weren't just using the party for cover. They'd planned it down to the hour. Get him surrounded by loved ones and cake and 80 balloons, make him feel safe and loved, then produce the papers in front of everyone so that when he signed, half the town would swear he'd done it happily, of his own free will. It was smart. It was patient. It was the coldest thing I've ever seen. Thursday came. I drove my grandfather to Dr. Hale's office, and I sat in the waiting room while a careful man asked careful questions for the better part of 2 hours. When they came out, Dr. Hale looked at me over his glasses and said, plainly, that Walter was one of the sharpest 80-year-olds he'd examined in years, fully oriented. Excellent recall. Sound judgment. He'd put it all in writing, dated and signed, the exact wall Ruth had told me to build. My grandfather looked pleased with himself in a quiet way, like a man who'd just balanced a ledger down to the penny. But it was what he did in the car afterward that I'll never forget. He reached into a canvas bag he'd brought and set an old tin box on my lap, the kind that once held holiday cookies, the lid gone soft with decades of opening. It had been my grandmother's. "It's time you had this," he said. I asked what was inside. He just told me to open it at home, alone, and to read the letter first. His hands were steady on his knees. His voice was steady too. But his eyes were shining, and I realized this quiet, competent man had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had finally decided to set part of it down. I held that tin box the whole ride, the metal cold through my sleeve, and something about it steadied me more than any legal document had. Here was a thing I could hold. Whatever came next, whatever my mother tried at that party, I had a doctor's signature saying my grandfather knew exactly who he was, and I had my grandmother's box on my lap, and I had a name and a number in my grandfather's neat hand. The wall was going up, but the heart of it wasn't in any file yet. It was in that box. I opened the tin box that night at my own kitchen table. On top was a letter in my grandmother's looping hand, written a few weeks before she died, back when I was still in nursing school. Nora Rayburn had known she was running out of time, and she'd used some of it to write to the future. The letter wasn't to me exactly. It was to the family, to be read when it mattered. She wrote about how she'd watched money curdle other families she'd known, how she'd seen inheritances turn brothers into strangers. She wrote that she was afraid of it happening to hers. And then she wrote a line about Paula that undid me. She knew my mother felt unloved. She wrote that Paula had spent her childhood believing Walter loved the memorial work, the church, the whole town more than his own daughter, and that some of that hurt was real, and some of it was a story Paula told herself, and that both kinds of hurt can rot a person from the inside. Please, my grandmother wrote, don't let money be the thing that decides who we are to each other. Under the letter was the reason all of it existed. My grandfather's original will and a deed of intention, spelling out that the house was never meant to be sold or handed to anyone. It was meant to fund a nursing scholarship in my grandmother's name, to send young women like me through school the way Nora had always dreamed. The house was never meant to be sold. It was meant to send nurses to school, in her name. I sat there a long time with my mother's voice in my head. He won't remember by Christmas anyway. And I thought, with a calm that surprised me, that he would remember. The doctor had proved it in writing. My grandmother had left the reason in a cookie tin. Now I just had to make sure the whole town saw it too. Friday, I filed the report with Adult Protective Services. I sat with the intake worker and laid it out cleanly, the way I'd chart a patient. The forwarded mail, the $18,000 in withdrawals, with the printout to back it, the added authorized user, the pending power of attorney application, Renata Poole and her commission and her booked appointment on his birthday, the doctor's capacity evaluation proving he was competent. I didn't editorialize. I didn't call my mother names. I gave them facts with dates attached, because facts with dates are the only thing that moves a bureaucracy. I also called the National Elder Fraud Hotline for guidance, and a patient voice walked me through what to expect and what my grandfather's rights were, including the fact that anyone acting as his agent could be legally required to account for every dollar in writing. I was doing all of this myself. One call at a time, one form at a time. No one was handing me a victory. I was building it with my own hands, late at night, between shifts. The caseworker took it seriously. She said she'd open an investigation, and then she said the thing I'd been dreading. These take time, Miss Overton. We have to interview everyone, review records. Realistically, that's weeks. I told her about the party, about the signing scheduled for that afternoon, the ambush dressed as a celebration. Her face tightened, but she was honest with me. She couldn't promise the investigation would conclude before then. The state moved at the state's pace. I drove home understanding that the machinery of justice, however real, was not going to arrive in time to save him at that party. If my grandfather was going to be protected, it was going to happen in that living room, in front of everyone, and I was going to have to be the one to do it. My mother found out about the doctor. I don't know how. Maybe the office called to confirm. Maybe Gerald had a contact. Maybe she just sensed the ground shifting under her. She called me Saturday, and this time there was no honey. "What do you think you're doing?" she said, low and shaking. "Taking him to some doctor behind my back. Digging around in his accounts. Do you have any idea how this looks?" I said I knew exactly how it looked. She talked over me. She called me a troublemaker. She said I was tearing the family apart, that I'd always thought I was better than everyone, that a real daughter would trust her mother. And there it was, the oldest weapon in her arsenal, the one that had worked on me my entire life. Guilt, aimed straight at the soft place where I'd always caved. "You're hurting the family. You're being selfish. Be quiet and everything will be fine." For 34 years, that sentence had folded me in half. I waited for the fold to come. It didn't. Something in me had finally set, like concrete cured hard overnight. "I'm not going to argue with you, Mom," I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd ever heard it. I love Grandpa, and I'm not going to be quiet. She went silent, genuinely stunned, because I had never once in my life said no to her, and meant it. Then she hissed that I'd regret this and hung up. I stood in my kitchen holding a dead phone, my heart pounding, and underneath the fear was something I hadn't felt in her presence in decades. Solid ground. For 34 years I apologized just to keep the peace. That day, I didn't. If you've ever finally stopped shrinking yourself for someone who only loved you when you were quiet, you understand. The hardest part was still ahead. Hit subscribe and stay with me. She moved fast after that. Within a day, she'd changed the locks on my grandfather's house, for his safety. She told the relatives, framing it as a loving daughter protecting a vulnerable man from a scheming granddaughter. She started calling family members with her version of events, that I was the one manipulating him, that I was after the house, that she'd caught me taking him to doctors and rifling through his money. She was good at it. By Sunday, 2 of my cousins wouldn't return my texts. She limited who could see him, screened his calls, and for 2 days I couldn't reach my grandfather at all. That silence was the worst part of the whole ordeal. I lay awake imagining him alone in that house with the new locks, wondering if I'd abandoned him, if he thought I'd given up. I want to be fair, because he taught me to be. There was one moment in those days that complicated everything. I drove past my mother's house on my way home from a shift and saw her sitting in her car in the driveway, not going in, just sitting there with her hands over her face, crying. Really crying, the kind you do when no one's supposed to see. And I understood, in a flash, that some of this was real fear. Gerald's business had collapsed and taken their savings with it. They were closer to losing their own home than anyone knew. She wasn't a cartoon. She was a frightened woman who had told herself a story where taking her father's house early was just claiming what would be hers anyway. I felt a pull of pity, sharp and unwelcome. Then I remembered his voice asking about his garden, and hers saying he wouldn't remember by Christmas, and the pity found its proper size. Frightened doesn't mean forgiven. I got to him through the one door my mother couldn't lock, my own profession. A friend of mine from work, Denise, ran a home health service, the legitimate kind, with credentials and a clipboard and every right to check on an elderly client's well-being. My grandfather called and requested a wellness visit himself, which was entirely his right, and my mother couldn't refuse it without looking exactly like what she was. Denise went, did a real assessment, and called me from her car afterward. He was fine, steady, sharp, eating well, more clear-eyed than half her clients. And he'd sent me a message through her. He'd anticipated the isolation. Before the locks changed, he had quietly done something with Ruth Delgado. He'd signed a limited legal authorization, freely and on the record, with an independent witness present, giving Ruth standing to act on the money issues on his behalf. Not a power of attorney handing away his life, the opposite. A narrow, deliberate instrument to protect his accounts, while he stayed fully in charge of himself. He'd built his own countermove while I was building mine. It hit me then that I'd spent this whole time thinking I was rescuing him, and the truth was closer to a partnership. He wasn't a helpless old man I was saving. He was a competent one who'd chosen his ally, gathered his documents, and set the timing, and who trusted me to be the face of it when the moment came. Denise passed along one more line from him, and it was pure Walter. Tell Sam not to worry about the party. Tell her to let them bring their papers. I sat in the parking lot after we hung up and laughed for the first time in a week. He wasn't hiding anymore. Neither of us was. We were getting ready to stand in the open. Over the next week, the pieces came together, and not one of them fell from the sky. I want to be clear about that because it matters. No secret savior showed up. No lucky document appeared at the last second. Everyone who stood with my grandfather in the end was someone one of us had gone out and found, on purpose, with effort. Ruth, the attorney, ready with the paper trail and the authority he'd granted her. Dr. Hale, whose evaluation sat in my bag like a shield. The APS caseworker, whose open investigation gave the whole thing weight even if it wouldn't conclude in time. Denise, who could speak to his actual condition as a professional. I met with Ruth to plan, and she gave me the single most important piece of advice I got through the whole ordeal. "You can't just accuse your mother," she said. "If you stand up and call her a thief, it's your word against hers, daughter against mother, and half that room will look away. You have to let her show them herself. Let her produce the papers. Let her make her pitch. Then, when she's committed, in front of everyone, you put the truth on the table. Facts, not feelings. Documents, not shouting." It was the asymmetry again, laid out like a map. My mother's power was performance, so we would let her perform, all the way to the edge, and then we would answer performance with proof. I asked Ruth if she'd come to the party. She smiled. I wouldn't miss it. That night I called my grandfather, and for the first time since the whole thing started I heard him laugh, a real one. "Let them light the candles," he said. "Let them sing. And then, Sam, let's blow the whole thing out." We had 6 days. I spent those 6 days assembling a folder. Not a dramatic thing, just a plain, manila folder. But I built it the way I'd build a case for a patient in a family meeting where the stakes were someone's whole life. On top, Dr. Hale's capacity evaluation, dated, signed, unambiguous. Behind it, the bank printout with the $18,000 in withdrawals highlighted, and the record of Gerald being added as an authorized user. Behind that, the confirmation that Adult Protective Services had opened an investigation. Then the documentation on Renata Poole, her lack of any real license, her commission structure, her booked appointment on the birthday. And at the very back, the two things that mattered most: my grandmother's letter and the original will with its deed of intention, the house pledged to a nursing scholarship in Nora's name. I thought hard about whether to record anything at the party, and I decided against it. It would have been the easy move, hiding a phone, catching my mother saying something ugly, but it would also have made me small, made this about a gotcha instead of the truth. My grandfather had chosen the honest road at every step, playing forgetful only to expose a real crime, never faking evidence, only revealing what was already true. I'd do the same. Everything in that folder was real, obtained the right way, able to stand in any room and any court. That was the whole difference between us and them. They dealt in what things looked like. We dealt in what things were. The night before the party, I laid it all out on my bed and checked it twice, the way I check a medication order, because being right isn't enough if you're sloppy. Then I put on the calm I use at the worst bedsides. Say the truth clearly. Say it once. Let it land. 2 days out, I learned the rest of their plan, because Renata Poole was careless with her scheduling, and my cousin, the one who'd finally answered my texts, told me what my mother had been saying at the family group chat I'd been quietly removed from. The choreography was uglier than I'd imagined. At the party, after the cake, my mother would gather everyone and give a little speech about how hard this was for her, how much she loved her father, how his memory was failing and someone had to step in. Then, gently, lovingly, in front of the pastor and the neighbors and the whole family, she'd invite him to sign the power of attorney for transparency, so everyone can see it's his choice. Renata would be standing by with the pen. The audience wasn't an accident. It was the whole strategy. If 40 people watched a sweet daughter help her confused father sign a paper, then later, if anyone questioned it, 40 people would say it looked perfectly loving. She was manufacturing witnesses to her own crime. My cousin also told me, voice low, that they'd invited the pastor specifically, and a couple of Walter's oldest neighbors, people whose word carried weight in Bellhaven. My mother had thought about optics down to the guest list. I hung up and sat with it, and instead of fear, I felt something clarify. She'd built a room full of witnesses to bless her. Fine. A room full of witnesses cuts both ways. She was about to make her case in front of the exact people who most needed to hear the truth, with a pastor present to see it, with neighbors who'd remember. She thought she'd loaded the room in her favor. She'd actually just gathered my jury. The night before the party, I talked to my grandfather for a long time. He was calm in the way that steadied me. We went over what would happen, who would say what, when I'd open the folder. He told me not to be nervous, that the hardest part, the deciding, was already behind us. Then he said something that connected the whole thing back to the beginning, to the day he'd pulled me through his door. "You remember what I told you," he said. "Get inside, hide, right now." I said I'd never forget it. "That was the last time you'll ever need to hide from your mother," he said. "Tomorrow you don't hide. Tomorrow you stand right where everyone can see you." I had to press the phone hard against my ear so he wouldn't hear me get choked up. Then he told me one more thing, and it made me nervous and awed at the same time. He was going to play the fog one final time. When my mother started her speech, when Renata brought out the papers, he was going to sit there looking confused and small, the perfect helpless father, and let Paula commit all the way, let her say every damning thing in front of every guest, before he dropped the act. "I need her to show them who she is before she finds out who I am," he said. It was a risk. If anything went wrong in that window, if he slipped or someone rushed the signing, we could lose. But it was his call, his life, his house, and he'd earned the right to end it his way. "One last performance," he said, and I could hear the tired smile in it. "Then no more pretending, Sam. For either of us." I didn't sleep. I don't think he did either. The party looked like love. That was the awful part. When I walked into my grandfather's house that afternoon, the locks changed so my own key didn't work, and I had to be let in like a guest. It was warm and bright and full of people. Someone had strung 80 gold balloons across the living room. There was a sheet cake with his name in blue frosting, a table of casseroles, neighbors laughing, the pastor shaking hands, and in the middle of it, my mother, radiant, playing the role of her life, the devoted daughter. She moved through the room touching arms, accepting sympathy, murmuring about how hard it was to watch her father decline, but how blessed she was to care for him. It was a performance so smooth it turned my stomach, because I could see now what it was for. This warmth, this crowd, this whole loving scene was the set. The status she'd always wanted wasn't really the house or even the money. It was this. The image, the good daughter, admired by the whole town for shouldering the sad burden of a failing father. Gerald stood by the wall with a drink he wasn't drinking, watching the door. And near the hallway, out of the flow of guests, stood Renata Poole in a good blazer with a slim leather folio under her arm, waiting for her cue. My grandfather sat in his chair by the window, small and vague, letting a neighbor pat his hand. He didn't look at me. He was already deep in the fog, playing his part. I found a spot near the fireplace with my plain manila folder held against my side, and I made myself breathe. Then my mother picked up a fork, tapped it against her wine glass, and the room began to quiet. "Everyone," she said, "I have an announcement about Dad." She was wonderful. I have to give her that. She stood in the center of that room with tears already gathering, perfectly timed, and she told the story she'd built. How Dad had been struggling, how he forgot things now, got confused, couldn't manage his affairs the way he used to. How it broke her heart, but somebody had to protect him. From scams, from bad decisions, from himself. A few of the older neighbors nodded along, faces soft with sympathy. She said she'd talked to a wonderful consultant who specialized in helping families through exactly this. She gestured, and Renata stepped forward with the folio and a warm professional smile. "So today," my mother said, "with all of you here, our family, so there's no secret about any of it, Dad's going to sign over financial power of attorney to me, out in the open, so everyone can see it's his wish." It was masterful. She'd wrapped a robbery in the language of transparency. Renata opened the folio on the coffee table, smoothed the papers, and uncapped a pen. My grandfather, in his chair, looked up with damp, confused eyes and asked, in his best foggy voice, whether it was time for cake. The room laughed gently, tenderly, and I watched 40 people fall a little more in love with the story of the poor, confused old man and his devoted daughter. Renata guided the pen toward his hand. "Just here, Walter," she said sweetly. "Right on the line." My mother beamed. Gerald leaned forward off the wall. This was the moment they'd built everything toward, the signature in front of witnesses, the crime made to look like a blessing. I felt every eye in the room ready to watch him sign. I set my drink down, and I stepped forward into the middle of the floor. "Before Grandpa signs anything," I said, "I think everyone here should hear a few things first." My voice came out level, not loud. I'd spent years learning to speak calmly in rooms full of frightened families, and that training held. The room turned to look at me. My mother's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes went flat and hard. "Samantha," she said, warm for the crowd, a warning underneath. "This isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," I said. "You said you wanted this done in the open, in front of everyone. Good. Let's do it in the open." I could feel the crowd's attention sharpen, that shift when people sense a scene is about to turn into something real. Renata paused with the pen still hovering. Gerald's jaw tightened. My mother took a step toward me, lowering her voice to that private, cutting register only family gets to hear. "You are embarrassing yourself," she breathed. "Sit down." The old reflex flickered. One last time. The pull to fold, to apologize, to make the discomfort go away. I looked past her to my grandfather in his chair, who was watching me now, the fog thinning in his eyes. Then I looked back at my mother and I did not sit down. "I'm a nurse, Mom," I said, calm as still water. "I take care of people Grandpa's age every day, and I know exactly what it looks like when someone healthy gets treated as if they're already gone." I turned slightly, so I was speaking to the room now, to the pastor and the neighbors and the cousins, not to her. "You all came here to celebrate his 80th birthday, so before anyone signs away his life, you deserve to know who he actually is and what's really been happening in this house." The quieter I got, the more the whole room leaned in. My mother had built her plan on being the only one talking. I'd just taken the floor. I opened the folder and I laid it out one page at a time, the way you build something so solid no one can argue with it. "This is a full cognitive evaluation," I said, setting the first page on the coffee table beside Renata's papers. "Done 3 days ago by Dr. Hale, a geriatric specialist. It says my grandfather is completely competent, sharp memory, sound judgment, fully capable of managing his own affairs." A murmur moved through the room. My mother's story had rested on one claim, and I'd just put a doctor's signature through the heart of it. "This," I said, laying down the next page, "is his bank record from the last 3 months. $18,000 in withdrawals he never made. And here, the paperwork adding Gerald as an authorized user on his account, notarized by that woman." I nodded at Renata, who had gone very still. "This is a letter from Adult Protective Services confirming they've opened an investigation into the financial abuse of Walter Rayburn." The word abuse landed on the room like a dropped plate. The pastor straightened. 2 neighbors exchanged a look. "And this woman with the pen," I went on evenly, "is Renata Poole. She's not a lawyer. She's not a social worker. She's a notary who gets paid a commission for every elderly person she gets to sign papers, fast, before their families can object. She has an appointment booked for this exact afternoon, on his birthday." I let that sit. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't call my mother a thief. I just kept putting true things on the table, one after another, until the warm story she'd told fell apart in front of the very witnesses she'd gathered to bless it. Renata slowly capped her pen and slid the folio off the table. The neighbors weren't looking at the confused old man anymore. They were looking at my mother. And my mother had started to breathe fast. Renata tried to save herself first, the way people do when the deal goes bad. "Everything I do is completely legal," she said, straightening her blazer, reaching for professional calm. "The family requested my services. There's nothing legal about rushing a competent man into signing away his assets," said a new voice from the doorway. Ruth Delgado stepped into the room, gray-haired and unhurried, and every lawyer instinct in her filled the space. I'm Mr. Rayburn's attorney. He granted me limited authority 2 weeks ago, freely, with a witness, while fully competent, precisely because he knew this was coming. Ms. Poole, you may want to speak to your own lawyer before you say another word. Renata's mouth closed. She picked up her folio, and without another sound, she left. That's the thing about people who treat lives like transactions. The second the transaction turns dangerous, they're gone. Then everyone looked at Gerald. He was still by the wall, but the confidence had drained out of him, leaving something small and cornered. The 18,000 went into an account you're on, Gerald, I said quietly. Your business closed in the spring. You're behind on your own house. I wasn't guessing. It was all in the folder. He opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and shut it again. In the space of 5 minutes, the whole apparatus my mother had built, the consultant, the money man, the machine, had folded and gone quiet, because none of it could survive daylight. That was always the difference. Their entire plan needed the dark, needed the confusion, needed no one to look too closely. The moment the truth was on the table in front of witnesses, it collapsed under its own weight. Only my mother was left standing in the center of the room, and the whole town was watching her now. Then my grandfather stood up. He did it slowly, but not the way a frail man stands. He rose the way a judge rises, and when he was on his feet, the fog was gone from his face completely, and every person in that room saw the difference at once. The confused old man they'd been pitying for the last 20 minutes had vanished, and in his place was Walter Rayburn, 40 years the town's accountant, sharp as the day he'd retired. I'd like to say something at my own party, he said, and his voice carried without rising. The room went utterly silent. I'm not confused. I haven't been. I've known for months what my daughter and her husband were planning, and I let them think I was slipping so they'd show me the whole of it instead of taking it a piece at a time. He looked around at his neighbors, at the pastor, at the cousins. I asked my granddaughter to hide in my kitchen the day they came with those papers, so she'd hear it with her own ears and believe it. Everything she just showed you is true. I'm sound of mind. Dr. Hale will confirm it, and nothing gets signed in this house today. A neighbor let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the sound of relief and astonishment together. My grandfather turned to me, and just for a second the accountant softened into the grandfather who used to save me the corner pieces of the cake. Then he looked at his daughter. I stepped up beside him, calm as I'd promised myself I'd stay, and I said the only thing that needed saying to the woman who'd started all of this. No one signs anything today, Mom. It's over. That was when my mother broke. All the warmth, all the careful performance, all the loving daughter polish she'd spent weeks applying cracked and fell away, and what came out was raw and loud and ugly. You have no idea what I've given up for this family, she shouted, and heads jerked back all over the room. 40 years I stood in his shadow while he poured everything into that memorial, into her, into strangers, and I got nothing. Nothing. She jabbed a finger at my grandfather, then at me. And now you all stand here judging me, when I'm the only one who ever... Her voice climbed and cracked. You're all against me. It was the exact inversion the whole thing had been building toward, and I felt it land. The villain of the room was no longer a confused old man being robbed. It was a shouting woman, red-faced, spitting blame at her own father on his 80th birthday, in front of the pastor she'd invited to lend her credibility. The louder she got, the smaller she became. And I stayed quiet. I want you to understand that I didn't shout back. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I just stood beside my grandfather and let her keep going, because every word she said proved everything I'd put on that table, and the whole town was watching her prove it. When she finally ran out of breath, shaking, mascara streaked, the silence that followed was the loudest thing in the house. Get inside. Hide right now, I said gently, and she stared at me, not understanding. That's what Grandpa told me the day you came for his house. I hid, and I listened, and I heard everything. I let that settle. I'm not hiding anymore, and neither is he. She had no answer. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say to me. I reached into the folder one last time and took out Dr. Hale's evaluation again, and I held it up, not as a weapon now, just as a fact. My mother had said one thing at that first meeting that had lived in my chest for weeks like a splinter, and it was time to answer it. "You told them he wouldn't remember by Christmas anyway," I said, quiet enough that the room had to hold its breath to hear me. "You said it like it didn't matter." I set the page down in front of her. "He'll remember this Christmas, and everyone after it." She looked at the paper, at the doctor's signature, at her father standing tall and clear-eyed beside me, and something in her finally